Sometimes the wilderness brings you exactly what you need, even when you don't know you need it. For Elias Cade, a man who'd spent 50 years running from his past in Montana's remote mountains, that gift came in the form of a giant mountain lion that should have killed him but didn't. Deep in the Bitterroot wilderness, where most folks fear to tread, Elias was tracking elk when he came face to face with this magnificent beast. The lion was massive, bigger than any he'd seen in 5 decades of mountain living. But instead of attacking, something remarkable happened. The great cat simply watched him, then began to follow. For days, these two old warriors of the wild traveled together through snow and storm. What started as a strange truce became something deeper, a bond that would force Elias to confront the ghosts he'd been hiding from for half his life. But why didn't this powerful predator attack when it had every opportunity? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered prayer against the mountainside, its log walls darkened by decades of Montana winters and summers that could crack a man's soul wide open. Elias Cade had built it with his own hands 30 years ago, back when his shoulders were broader and his heart held more than just the echoes of what used to be. Now at 72, he moved through its single room with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that every motion mattered when you lived this far from anywhere that resembled civilization. The morning ritual never changed. Coffee first, black, as the shadows that pooled in the valley below brewed in an enamel pot that had seen more sunrises than most folks saw in a lifetime. Then the weather check, standing on the narrow porch that faced east toward the Bitterroot peaks, reading the sky like scripture. Today it promised clear skies and bitter cold, the kind that made your breath hang in the air like visible prayers. Inside, the cabin told the story of a man who'd stripped his life down to essentials. A wood stove dominated one corner, its iron belly warm and crackling with split pine. A narrow bed occupied another, covered with quilts his wife Sarah had made before the cancer took her voice, then her laughter, then finally her altogether. The walls held only what mattered. A faded photograph of 3 people who'd once been a family, a hand-carved wooden cross no bigger than a man's thumb, and a Winchester rifle that had put more meat on the table than Elias cared to count. But it was the cross that drew his eyes this morning, as it did most mornings when the silence pressed too close. He'd carved it during those long nights in the hospital when Sarah lay dying, and he needed something for his hands to do besides shake. The wood was pine from their old property down in the valley, cut from a tree where his son Tommy used to. A climb back when Tommy was 8, and the world was full of branches to conquer and streams to cross. 20 years since that hunting trip that was supposed to teach the boy about responsibility and respect for the wilderness. 20 years since a moment's distraction. Elias spotting a magnificent elk and forgetting to watch where. His 15-year-old son was walking, had sent Tommy over a cliff edge that should have been clearly marked in any decent father's mind. The coffee had gone cold while memory did its cruel work. Elias poured it out, watching the dark liquid stain the snow beneath his porch. Waste bothered him these days, but not as much as the alternative of drinking something that tasted like regret. He dressed in layers, the way a man learned to dress when the nearest hospital was a 3-hour ride through mountain passes that could kill you as easy as look at you. Long underwear, flannel shirt, wool sweater Sarah had knitted before her fingers got too stiff to hold needles. Over it all, the canvas jacket that bore the scars of 50 years in timber country, cuts from chainsaw chains, burns from campfire sparks, patches where Sarah's patient hands had mended what the wilderness tried to tear apart. The snowshoes, weighted by the door, ash frames strung with rawhide that he'd learned to weave from his grandfather, who'd learned from men who died before the first roads cut through these mountains. Everything had a history here, a chain of knowledge passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, from folks who understood that wisdom wasn't something you read in books, but something you earned with frostbite and sweat and the occasional broken bone. Outside, the world wore winter like a familiar coat. Snow 3 feet deep in the meadows, deeper where it drifted against the north-facing slopes. The kind of snow that could hide a man's mistakes, cover up the places where he'd stumbled, make everything look clean and untouched until spring came and revealed what had been buried underneath. Elias had been tracking the elk herd for 3 days now, following sign that led deeper into the high country than he usually ventured this late in the season. But the herd was small this year. The harsh spring had been hard on the calves, and his cache of venison was running lower than he liked. A man alone had to think ahead, plan for the lean months when even the ravens disappeared and silence became a living thing. The tracks were fresh this morning, deep prints in snow that had crusted over during the night. A bull, a big one, from the size of the hoofprints, probably traveling with 2 or 3 cows. Moving steady but not spooked, which meant they hadn't caught his scent yet. The wind was right, coming down from the peaks and carrying his human smell back toward the cabin instead of forward toward the prey. He'd learned patience in these mountains, the kind that came from understanding that nature moved on its own schedule, and no amount of human urgency could hurry what needed its own time. Tommy had been learning that lesson too, that last day, learning to read sign, to move quiet, to think like the animal you were hunting instead of like the impatient boy you used to be. Remember, son, he told the boy that morning, hunting isn't about taking a life. It's about understanding one. You got to know how the elk thinks, where he's going to move, what scares him and what doesn't. You become part of his world for a while, and if you're respectful enough, careful enough, maybe he'll give you what you need. Tommy had nodded, serious in the way that boys got serious when their fathers shared knowledge that felt important. He'd been a good listener, that boy. Quick to learn, quick to laugh, quick to forgive his old man's mistakes. Too quick, maybe, to trust that his father would keep him safe. The trail led upward, switching back and forth through stands of lodgepole pine that grew thick enough to block the wind, but sparse enough to let a man move without fighting branches at every step. Elias moved with the careful economy of motion that came from decades of walking in snow, each step deliberate, each pause calculated to listen for sounds that didn't belong, the crack of a twig that meant something besides wind, the shuffle of hooves on stone, the whisper of breath that wasn't his own. But the mountains held their secrets close this morning. No sound but his own breathing, muffled and rhythmic inside the wool scarf Sarah had made to keep the cold from freezing his lungs. No movement but his own shadow, growing shorter as the sun climbed toward its brief winter zenith. 2 hours up the trail, he found where the elk had stopped to browse on the bitter bark of mountain ash, stripping it with their teeth in the methodical way that hungry animals worked. The sign was good, fresh, recent, maybe an hour ahead of him at most. He could smell them now, that wild musk that spoke of creatures who'd never known a fence or a barn or the sound of human voices calling them to feed. The country was opening up ahead, the thick timber giving way to a series of natural meadows, connected by game trails that had been worn into the mountainside by generations of hooves. Dangerous country for a hunter, too open, too easy for quarry to spot movement and disappear into the maze of ravines and rockfall that scarred the upper slopes. But it was beautiful country too, the kind that made a man understand why he'd chosen this life of solitude over the alternative of town living and neighbors who thought they knew how to fix what was broken inside him. Here the brokenness didn't matter so much. Here a man could carry his grief like a familiar pack, heavy but balanced, something he'd learned to live with instead of something he needed to cure. The elk sign led toward a saddle between 2 peaks, where Elias had hunted before, years ago, when Tommy was small and Sarah would pack lunches for their day trips into the high country. Family trips, back when family meant something more than photographs and memories and a wooden cross carved during hospital vigils. He was thinking about those days, letting his mind wander in the way that old men's minds wandered when the body was doing work it had done 10,000 times before, when he stepped around a massive Douglas fir and came face to face with something that stopped his heart mid-beat. The mountain lion was enormous, easily twice the size of any cat he'd encountered in 5 decades of wilderness living. It crouched maybe 30 yards away, powerful haunches bunched with muscle, tail switching with predatory focus. But it wasn't looking at the elk sign that had brought Elias here. It was looking directly at him. Their eyes met across the snow-covered meadow, amber meeting blue, wild meeting weathered. And in that instant, Elias felt something shift in the fundamental order of things. His hand didn't move toward the rifle slung across his shoulder. His feet didn't take the careful backward steps that experience said they should take. Instead, he found himself simply standing there, meeting the great cat's stare with something that felt less like fear and more like recognition. The lion's coat was the color of winter grass, tawny gold marked with the faint shadows of spots that spoke of genetic memory reaching back to ancestors who'd hunted these mountains when they were young, and the ice was still retreating toward the poles. Its shoulders rippled with muscle that could snap a man's neck with casual efficiency, and its paws left tracks in the snow that were bigger around than Elias's work-worn hands. But there was something in those amber eyes that spoke of more than predatory intent. Something that looked almost like curiosity, or perhaps the kind of careful assessment that one old warrior might give another when they met on neutral ground. For a long moment neither of them moved. The wind stirred the pine boughs overhead, setting loose a small cascade of snow that fell between them like a curtain briefly drawn and then swept aside. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called, its voice harsh and questioning in the thin mountain air. Then, without any sound that Elias could hear, the great cat rose from its crouch and began to walk. Not away, as any sensible wild animal should walk when confronted with human scent and human presence. Instead, it angled across the meadow, moving with liquid grace through snow that came nearly to its belly, following a path that would bring it no closer to Elias, but wouldn't take it any farther away either. Elias found himself moving too, not in pursuit, but in a kind of parallel course that seemed to suggest they were both traveling toward the same general destination without either one committing to the idea of traveling together. It was the strangest hunting experience of his life, and he'd had some strange ones over the years. The elk sign led deeper into the high country, and both man and lion followed it, maintaining their careful distance, neither acknowledging the other's presence, yet neither able to ignore it completely. It felt like a dance, whose steps neither of them had learned, but both somehow knew, a wilderness ballet performed for an audience of mountains and sky. As the afternoon light began to angle toward evening, painting the snow with shadows that ran long and blue toward the valley floor, Elias realized that something fundamental had changed in his carefully ordered world of solitude and routine. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't alone in the wilderness, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand. That didn't scare him nearly as much as it should have. The sound reached him before the sight did, a low, sustained growl that spoke of pain rather than threat, the kind of sound that made something deep in Elias's chest tighten with unwanted recognition. He'd heard that sound before, years ago, coming from his own throat during the long nights after Sarah's funeral, when grief felt like a physical weight pressing down on his ribs. The great cat had disappeared from view an hour earlier, vanishing into a stand of aspen that grew thick along the creek bottom. Elias had continued following the elk sign, telling himself he wasn't disappointed by the absence of those amber eyes watching him from the edge of his vision. But when the growling started, low, rhythmic, urgent, he found his feet turning toward the sound without any conscious decision from his brain. He found the lion in a small clearing where spring runoff had carved a natural depression in the mountainside. The magnificent creature was lying on its side, breathing hard, one massive front paw held awkwardly away from its body. Even from 50 yards away, Elias could see the problem. The cruel steel teeth of a leg-hold trap, rusted but still functional, clamped tight around the cat's left front leg, just above the paw. "Jesus," he whispered, the word fogging in the cold air. The trap was old, probably left by some poacher years ago, and forgotten until this moment when hunger or curiosity had led the lion to step in exactly the wrong place. The chain that should have anchored it to a tree had broken, allowing the cat to travel but not escape, dragging the weight of old iron and older cruelty wherever it went. The lion's head lifted as Elias approached, those amber eyes fixing on him with an intensity that should have sent him backing away. Instead, he found himself moving closer, speaking in the low, steady voice he'd once used to calm spooked horses and frightened children. "Easy now, big fellow. I know it hurts. I know you don't understand why it hurts, but I'm going to try to help if you'll let me." 20 yards, 15, 10. The lion's breathing was labored, flanks heaving with the effort of managing pain that had probably been building for hours. Up close, Elias could see that the trap had bitten deep, cutting through fur and hide too, the muscle beneath. The paw was swollen, the toes spread wide in a way that suggested bones might be cracked or worse. He knelt in the snow, moving slowly enough to give the great cat time to object, if objection was what it had in mind. But the lion simply watched him, head raised, ears forward, as if it was trying to solve a puzzle that had no precedent in its wild experience. "I had a son once," Elias said, not sure why he was talking, but unable to stop the words from coming. "Tommy. He got himself caught in something too, only it wasn't a trap made of steel. It was a trap made of my own carelessness, my own moment of looking away when I should have been paying attention. The trap mechanism was simpler than some he'd seen, more brutal than others. Two heavy jaws held closed by a spring system that would require precise pressure in exactly the right spots to release. The kind of thing that would take two hands and considerable strength, even when you weren't trying to perform the operation on a predator that could remove your head with one swipe of its free paw. The thing about traps," Elias continued, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket for the leather work gloves that might provide some small protection against teeth and claws, "is that they don't care about intention. They don't care if you meant to step there or not. They just hold on until someone comes along who knows how to let them go." The lion made no sound as Elias positioned himself near the trap, but its breathing had changed, becoming deeper, more controlled, almost as if it was preparing for something it understood would be necessary but unpleasant. In his jacket pocket beneath the gloves, Elias's fingers found the familiar shape of Tommy's old hunting knife. He'd carried it for 20 years without ever consciously deciding to carry it, the way a man carries keys or coins or other small reminders of a life that used to make sense. The bone handle was worn smooth by a boy's eager hands, and the blade still held the edge that Tommy had been so proud to maintain. "You were always better with the knife than I was," Elias whispered, though whether he was talking to his dead son or the injured lion he couldn't have said. "Steady hands, patient. Remember how you'd skin a rabbit so careful, making sure not to waste any of the meat? Every part serves a purpose, Dad, you used to say. Even the bones could make soup." The memory hit him harder than the mountain wind, more painful than the arthritis in his joints or the loneliness that had been his closest companion for 2 decades. Tommy, at 13, working over a freshly killed grouse with the concentration of a surgeon, determined to prove he was old enough to handle the responsibilities that came with taking a life to sustain your own. "I should have been watching you instead of watching that elk," Elias said. And this time he was definitely talking to Tommy, the words finally finding their way out of the place where he'd kept them buried. "Should have known that cliff edge was too close. Should have made sure you stayed back where it was safe. But I got distracted by the size of that buck. Started thinking about the winter meat it would provide, and I forgot the most important job I had. The trap was going to require both hands and all of his strength. which meant putting the rifle down and trusting that the lion's current cooperative mood would continue once pain started shooting up its leg. Elias unslung the Winchester and laid it carefully in the snow, close enough to grab if things went wrong, but far enough away that he wouldn't accidentally damage it if the cat decided to object to the proceedings. Tommy was 15 when it happened, he told the lion, whose amber eyes had never left his face. Old enough to think he knew everything, young enough to trust his old man to keep him safe. We were tracking an elk, biggest one either of us had ever seen, and when it finally showed itself, I got so focused on making the shot that I didn't notice Tommy had moved up to get a better view. The first touch of his hands on the trap mechanism made the lion's entire body go rigid, but it didn't pull away. Instead, it seemed to brace itself, the same way Tommy used to brace himself when Sarah cleaned a cut or splinter from his hands. The glyph wasn't marked on any of the maps, Elias continued, working his fingers into position on the trap's release mechanisms. Just a natural drop-off where the mountain had sheared away during some long-ago earthquake, maybe 40 feet down, to a pile of rocks that had been waiting there for 10,000 years, waiting for someone to make a mistake. The trap springs were stiff with rust and age, requiring more pressure than his 72-year-old hands wanted to provide. But pain was just pain, and pain was something Elias had learned to work through over the years. He pressed harder, feeling the mechanism start to give, while the lion watched with an intensity that felt almost human. "I made the shot," he said, grunting with effort as the springs began to compress. "Clean kill, right through the heart. I was so proud of that shot, so focused on where the elk had fallen, that I didn't hear Tommy call out until it was too late. By the time I turned around, he was already falling." The trap opened with a metallic click that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. The lion pulled its injured paw free immediately, but instead of fleeing or attacking, it simply lay there, looking at Elias with something that might have been gratitude, or might have been the kind of recognition that passes between creatures who've both known unexpected kindness in cruel circumstances. "I climbed down to him as fast as I could," Elias said, settling back on his heels and pulling off the leather gloves that were now stained with blood that wasn't his own. "But there's no climbing fast enough to outrun a 40-foot fall onto granite." He was still alive when I reached him, still conscious. He looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I know you told me to stay back." The lion was testing its injured leg now, putting weight on it carefully, flexing the toes that had been trapped and compressed. The paw was damaged, but functional, swollen but not broken, painful but not crippling. It would heal, given time and care and the remarkable resilience that wild things possessed when they weren't giving up hope. "And those were the last words he ever said to me," Elias finished, his voice barely audible above the wind in the pines. "An apology for something that was never his fault. An apology I should have been making to him." Storm clouds were building over the western peaks, dark and heavy with the promise of snow that could make travel dangerous for man and beast alike. The temperature was dropping as the short winter day began its slide toward evening, and the injured lion would need shelter and rest if it was going to survive the night. But as Elias gathered his rifle and prepared to head back toward his cabin, the great cat made no move to disappear into the timber. Instead, it rose to its feet with careful dignity, favoring the injured paw but mobile enough to travel, and began to follow the same trail that Elias was taking back down the mountain. Behind them, the abandoned trap lay open in the snow like a steel mouth that had finally learned to let go of what it had been holding too tightly for too long. The cave had been carved from the mountainside by centuries of wind and water, a natural shelter deep enough to block the worst of winters. Fury, but shallow enough that a man wouldn't feel buried alive when the storms came calling. Elias had discovered it 15 years ago during a hunting trip that had gone longer than planned, and he'd marked its location in the leather-bound journal he kept religiously, noting its position relative to landmarks that wouldn't change with the seasons. Now, As the first fat flakes of snow began to fall from clouds that had turned the color of old pewter, he was grateful for that long-ago notation. The storm building over the western peaks looked like the kind that could kill a man caught in the open, and the injured lion limping behind him would need more than pine boughs and wishful thinking to survive the night. "Come on, big fellow," he called over his shoulder, though he kept his voice low enough not to carry beyond the cat's acute hearing. "There's shelter ahead, if we can make it before this weather turns serious." The lion had been following him for 2 hours now, maintaining a respectful distance, but showing no inclination to disappear back into the timber. Its injured paw left tracks in the snow that spoke of pain carefully managed, each step deliberate and measured. Elias found himself adjusting his pace to match the cat's careful progress, the way he might slow down for an elderly hiking companion or a child struggling to keep up. The cave entrance was partially hidden behind a screen of stunted mountain mahogany, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Elias pushed through the brittle branches and stepped into darkness that smelled of stone and time and the accumulated winters of creatures who'd sheltered here before him. His flashlight revealed a space about the size of his cabin's main room, with a sandy floor that had been scoured clean by countless seasons of runoff and wind. Behind him, he could hear the lion's breathing, labored but steady. The great cat had stopped just outside the cave entrance, amber eyes reflecting his flashlight beam as it studied this new environment with the careful attention that wild things brought to unfamiliar places. "It's all right," Elias said, backing deeper into the cave to give the lion room to enter if it chose to. "I've used this place before. No bear sign, no other predator scent. Just stone and silence, and enough room for both of us to wait out whatever the sky's planning to throw at us." The lion stepped inside, with the fluid grace that seemed to characterize all its movements, even injured as it was. In the enclosed space, Elias could truly appreciate the creature's size. It was massive, easily 200 pounds of muscle and bone and wild intelligence. Its shoulders came nearly to his waist, and its head was broad enough that it could probably crush a man's skull without much effort if it chose to. But there was no aggression in its posture, no tension that suggested attack was being contemplated. Instead, the lion moved to the far wall of the cave and settled itself with careful attention to its injured paw, watching Elias with what looked more like curiosity than caution. "You know," Elias said, setting his pack down and beginning to unroll the emergency sleeping bag he always carried during winter travel, "I haven't shared quarters with anyone for more years than I care to count. Not since Sarah passed, anyway. And she'd probably have something to say about me inviting a mountain lion in for the night." He worked by flashlight, setting up a small camp that would see him through the storm without depleting too much of his limited resources. A handful of jerky and some hardtack biscuits for himself, water from his canteen that he'd refill with, snow once the storm passed. Simple fare for a simple shelter, but enough to keep body and soul together until morning brought clearer skies and safer travel. The lion watched every movement with the intense focus that predators brought to studying potential threats or opportunities. But when Elias pulled a piece of jerky from his pack and tore it in half, offering one portion across the cave, the great cat's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. It rose, crossed the stone floor with barely a sound despite its size, and delicately accepted the offered meat from Elias's fingers. "Well, I'll be damned," Elias whispered, feeling the careful pressure of teeth that could have taken his hand off, but instead treated his skin like it was made of the finest glass. "You've got manners, don't you? Someone taught you to take food. Gentle. Or maybe you just figured out that courtesy gets you further than violence in most situations." Outside, the wind had begun to howl with the particular fury that mountain storms brought when they meant business. Snow was falling harder now, visible in the cone of his flashlight beam as it swept past the cave entrance in horizontal sheets that spoke of a night when travel would be impossible and exposure would be fatal. "Looks like we're stuck with each." "Other until this blows through," Elias said, settling back against the cave wall with his sleeping bag pulled around his shoulders. "Might as well get acquainted properly. I already told you about Tommy, about how I failed him when he needed me most, but there's more to the story than just one moment of inattention." The lion had returned to its spot against the far wall, but its eyes remained fixed on Elias, with an attention that felt almost human in its intensity. In the enclosed space, with storm winds providing a soundtrack that ranged from whisper to roar, depending on the gusts, it was easy to imagine that the great cat was actually listening, actually processing the words that an old man needed to speak to someone, even if that someone happened to be a predator who probably understood none of them. "Tommy was born curious," Elias continued, surprised by how good it felt to say his son's name aloud in the presence of another living creature. "Always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked and why they worked that way. Sarah used to say he got that from me, but I think she was being kind. The boy had a mind that moved faster than mine ever did, even when I was young and thought I knew everything worth knowing." He pulled his journal from his jacket pocket, the leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Sarah had given it to him for his 40th birthday, back when 40 seemed old, and the idea of 70 was too distant to contemplate. Now it held 20 years of weather observations, wildlife sightings, and thoughts that a man living alone needed to write down before they disappeared into the silence that surrounded him. "I started keeping this journal the year Tommy was born," he said, holding it up so the lion could see, though he wasn't sure why that seemed important. "Figured I should document things for him, leave him some record of what his old man observed about the natural world. Wanted him to have something to read when he got older, something that would help him understand the country he was growing up in." The storm outside was reaching full fury now, wind driving snow through the cave entrance in swirls that melted before they could reach the back wall where man and lion waited for nature to exhaust its rage. The temperature was dropping steadily, turning their breath to visible clouds that dissipated in the beam of the flashlight. "I taught him to read tracks when he was 8, Elias said, opening the journal to pages that were filled with his careful handwriting, notes about weather, patterns and animal behavior, and the changing seasons that marked the passage of years in the wilderness. Started with the easy ones, deer, elk, bear, then moved on to the harder ones, fox, lynx, weasel. He had a good eye for it, better than mine in some ways. Could tell you not just what had passed, but when, and whether it was hurried or relaxed, hunting or being hunted. The lion's breathing had grown deeper, more regular, but its eyes remained open and alert. Elias found himself thinking about the times Tommy had fallen asleep during their camping trips, the way the boy would fight to stay awake long enough, to hear one more story, see one more shooting star, share one more moment of the closeness that came from being alone together in the wild places where the rest of the world felt very far away. "I never wrote down the most important lessons," Elias admitted, closing the journal and holding it against his chest like a talisman. "Never wrote down how to keep your boys safe when the excitement of the hunt makes you forget that some edges are sharper than they look, that some steps lead to places you can't come back from. Maybe I thought those lessons would teach themselves, or maybe I was just too proud to admit I didn't know everything worth knowing about keeping the people you love from harm." The lion's eyes reflected the flashlight beam like twin amber flames, steady and patient and somehow comforting in the darkness that pressed against their small circle of warmth and light. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the cave, two damaged creatures had found shelter not just from the weather, but from the particular kind of loneliness that came from carrying pain that couldn't be shared with anyone who would understand its weight. Morning came like a whispered blessing, soft light filtering through the cave entrance to reveal a world transformed by snow that had fallen steadily through the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind the peculiar silence that followed winter weather, a hush so complete it seemed to muffle even thoughts. Elias woke to find the great cat still watching him from across the cave, amber eyes alert and patient, as if it had been waiting for him to rejoin the waking world. "Well, good morning to you too," he said, his voice rough from sleep and the dry mountain air. "Looks like we both made it through the night in one piece." The lion rose and stretched, a fluid motion that spoke of wild grace, even with its injured paw held carefully off the ground. In the morning light, Elias could see that the swelling had gone down somewhat, though the cat still favored the leg as it moved toward the cave entrance to study the changed landscape. Outside, the world wore 4 inches of fresh powder over the existing snowpack, and the air held that crystalline quality that came after winter storms, when every breath felt clean enough to cut glass. The kind of morning that made a man grateful to be alive, even if being alive sometimes carried more weight than seemed reasonable. "You know what?" Elias said, rolling up his sleeping bag with movements that had become automatic over decades of wilderness travel. "I think I'm going to call you Ghost. Not because you're dead, but because you move so quiet and you showed up when I wasn't expecting company. That seem all right with you?" The lion, Ghost, turned its massive head to regard him with what might have been approval, or might have been the kind of polite tolerance that wild things showed to humans who talked too much. Either way, the name felt right, settled into place with the kind of certainty that came from decisions that didn't need second-guessing. They emerged from the cave into air so cold it made Elias's lungs ache. But the sun was brilliant against fresh snow, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only appeared after winter storms had scrubbed the atmosphere clean. Ghost tested its injured paw against the snow, putting weight on it gradually, seeming to assess how much the night's rest had helped the healing process. "Feels better, does it?" Elias asked, shouldering his pack and checking the rifle to make sure no snow had gotten into the action during the night. "Good. We've got some traveling to do if we want to make it back to my place before the next weather system moves through." The descent from the high country took them through terrain that Elias knew as well as the lines on his own hands. Game trails that had been worn into the mountainside by generations of hooves, creek crossings where the water ran dark and swift under shells of ice, meadows where the snow lay unbroken except for the tracks of small creatures going about there. Business of staying alive through another winter. Ghost followed at a distance that seemed to have been calculated with mathematical precision. Close enough to keep Elias in sight, far enough away to maintain the dignity that wild things carried. Like an invisible cloak, the great cat moved with surprising stealth for something its size, placing each paw with the kind of deliberation that left barely a whisper of sound in its wake. By mid-morning, they were walking through a stand of aspen that Elias remembered from family camping trips 25 years ago. The trees were older now, thicker, their white bark marked with the black scars that came from surviving decades of weather and wildlife. But the shape of the grove was the same, the way the morning light slanted through the bare branches created the same patterns he remembered from when Tommy was 7 and the world was full of adventures waiting to be discovered. "We used to camp here," he said, not sure if he was talking to Ghost or to the memory of his son that seemed to walk beside him whenever he visited places that held echoes of family happiness. Sarah would spread out a blanket under those big aspens, and Tommy would explore every square inch of the meadow while I got the fire started and the coffee going. He pulled the photograph from his jacket pocket, the one he'd carried for 20 years without ever quite deciding whether it was comfort or torment. 3 faces smiling at the camera. Sarah with her dark hair catching afternoon light, Tommy gap-toothed and grinning with the unself-conscious joy that children wore like their favorite clothes, and himself looking younger than he remembered ever being, looking like a man who believed the good times would last forever. "This was taken right here," he said, holding the photograph up so Ghost could see, though he wasn't sure why that seemed important. Tommy's 8th birthday camping trip. He was so excited to be old enough for a real wilderness adventure, so proud that his old man trusted him to handle himself in the backcountry. Ghost had stopped walking and was watching him with that intense focus that suggested the great cat understood more about human emotion than seemed possible for a wild creature. In the morning light, its coat looked like liquid gold, marked with the shadow spots that spoke of genetic memory reaching back to ancestors who'd hunted these mountains when they were young and the ice was still retreating toward the poles. He caught his first trout that weekend, Elias continued, tucking the photograph back into his pocket where it wouldn't be damaged by snow or wind or the tears that sometimes came without warning when memory did its work. Nothing fancy, just a little brook trout from the creek that runs through the bottom of this meadow. But he was so proud of that fish, so careful to clean it properly and cook it over the campfire. Said it was the best meal he'd ever tasted. They walked on, following the natural contours of the land as it sloped down toward the valley, where Elias's cabin waited like a promise of warmth and shelter, and the kind of solitude that had been his closest companion for 2 decades. But the solitude felt different now, less complete, softened by the presence of another creature that seemed to understand the weight of carrying loss without being crushed by it. The sun climbed higher, warming the air enough that snow began to slide from pine boughs in small avalanches that whispered through the forest like secrets being shared among friends. Ghost's breathing had returned to normal, and the great cat was putting more weight on its injured paw with each mile they traveled, healing with the remarkable resilience that wild things possessed when they weren't giving up hope. "You know what I think?" Elias said as they crested a ridge that offered a view of his cabin tucked against the mountainside, like a brown prayer in a white cathedral. "I think maybe we were both supposed to find each other yesterday. Maybe the wilderness has its own way of bringing together creatures who need company, even when they think they want to be alone." Ghost padded beside him in companionable silence, and for the first time in 20 years, Elias felt like he was walking home instead of just walking. Back to the place where he slept and ate and waited for time to pass. The difference was subtle but profound, like the difference between surviving and living, between existing and belonging to something larger than the boundaries of his own grief. Behind them, their tracks in the snow told the story of an unlikely partnership. Boot prints and paw prints side by side, 2 creatures who'd found each other in the wilderness and chosen companionship over solitude, healing over hiding, hope over the comfortable familiarity of old wounds that had been carried too long. 3 days into their unlikely partnership, Elias led Ghost to a place he hadn't visited in 15 years, a hidden valley that existed like a secret cupped in the mountain's palm, accessible only through a narrow passage between 2 towering walls of granite that had been carved by glacial action 10,000 years ago. The entrance was so well concealed that a man could walk past it a dozen times without noticing the gap in what appeared to be solid rock. "This was Tommy's favorite place," Elias said, as they squeezed through the passage, his voice echoing strangely off the stone walls that pressed close on either side. "Called it his secret kingdom. Sarah and I brought him here when he was 9, and he made us promise we'd never tell anyone else about it." The passage opened onto a meadow, roughly the size of 2 football fields, surrounded completely by walls of stone that rose 300 feet toward a circle of sky that seemed impossibly blue from the bottom of this natural cathedral. A spring-fed stream ran through the center of the valley, its water so clear you could count the stones on the bottom from 20 feet away. Grass grew thick and green even in winter, protected from the worst weather by the sheltering walls and warmed by underground springs that kept the temperature moderate year-round. Ghost entered the hidden valley with visible amazement, head turning from side to side as it took in the impossible geometry of this place that existed outside normal experience. The great cat's amber eyes reflected wonder of a kind that Elias hadn't expected to see in a wild predator. but then everything about Ghost seemed to exceed expectations. "It's like a different world, isn't it?" Elias said, settling himself on a fallen log that had served as his favorite thinking spot during the family camping trips that had been the highlight of every summer for 5 precious years. Tommy used to say this place was magic, that the normal rules didn't apply here. He might have been right about that. The memory came with the particular vividness that sometimes accompanied visits to places where happiness had once lived. Tommy, at 11, racing around the meadow's perimeter with his arms spread wide like airplane wings, his laughter echoing off the stone walls in waves that seemed to multiply until the entire valley rang with joy. Sarah sitting beside Elias on this same log, her hand warm in his, watching their son discover that the world was full of wonders waiting to be found by those brave enough to look for them. Sarah was sick by then, Elias said, his voice barely audible above the whisper of water over stone. We didn't know it yet. The cancer was still hiding, still gathering strength, but she was tired all the time. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't. A fix, but she never complained, never let Tommy see that anything was wrong. Ghost had moved to the stream's edge and was drinking deeply, its injured paw obviously much improved after days of careful rest and gradual healing. The great cat's reflection wavered in the moving water, golden fur and amber eyes doubled and distorted by the current's gentle motion. Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out the thin gold band that he wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath layers of flannel and wool. Sarah's wedding ring, worn smooth by 43 years on her finger, still carrying the faintest trace of her scent even after 5 years in his keeping. He'd never been able to bring himself to bury it with. Her couldn't bear the thought of putting that last piece of their life together into ground that would freeze solid for half the year. She died in the spring, he said, holding the ring up so it caught the afternoon light that slanted down from the circle of sky above. 5 years after we lost Tommy. The doctors said the grief might have weakened her immune system, made her more vulnerable to the cancer. But I think she just got tired of living in a world that didn't have our boy in it. The ring was warm from being next to his skin, warm with the accumulated heat of 5 years carried against his heart. He'd taken it off her finger himself after the nurses had finished their final ministrations, slipped it free with hands that shook like leaves in autumn wind. The last act of marriage, the final gesture of taking care of her needs, even when there was nothing left to take care of. I should have died with her, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them, raw and honest in a way that speaking to another human being had never allowed. Should have laid down beside her in that hospital bed and just stopped breathing, stopped trying to figure out how to live in a world that had taken everything that mattered. Ghost looked up from the stream, water droplets falling from its muzzle like tiny diamonds in the filtered light. The great cat's eyes held something that looked like understanding, or perhaps recognition of a pain that transcended the boundaries. Between species, in the wild, loss was a common experience. Mates killed by predators, cubs taken by disease or accident, territories lost to stronger competitors. But the capacity to grieve, to carry loss like a physical weight for years beyond the original wound, that might be uniquely human, or perhaps not. Perhaps Ghost carried its own griefs, its own memories of companionship interrupted by circumstances, beyond anyone's control. But dying seemed like giving up, Elias continued, tucking the ring back beneath his shirt where it belonged, close to the heart that still beat despite having been broken beyond any reasonable hope of repair. And Sarah raised me better than to be a quitter. She used to say that as long as you're breathing, you've got work left to do in the world. Took me 5 years to figure out what she meant by that. The afternoon light was beginning to change, taking on the golden quality that came in the hour before sunset in the mountains. Shadows were growing longer, reaching across the hidden valley like fingers pointing toward the passage that would take them back to the normal world, where survival was work and solitude was a choice rather than a consequence. Tommy would have. "Loved knowing about you," Elias told Ghost, who had settled itself in a patch of grass warmed by the sun. "Would have wanted to study your tracks, figure out what you ate and where you slept and how you thought about the world." He had that kind of curiosity, the kind that made everything seem interesting if you looked at it the right way. A pair of ravens flew overhead, calling to each other in the harsh language that had been echoing through these mountains since long before humans arrived to complicate the business of living and dying. Their shadows passed across the meadow, like dark blessings, reminders that life continued its ancient patterns, regardless of individual grief or joy, or the thousand small daily choices that separated flourishing from merely enduring. "I think he would have understood what's happening here," Elias said, gesturing toward the space between himself and Ghost, the invisible something that had formed during their days together in the wilderness. "Would have recognized that some friendships don't need words to be real, don't need explanation to be valuable." As the sun slipped lower toward the western rim of their stone cathedral, Ghost rose and padded over to where Elias sat, settling itself close enough that the old man could feel the warmth radiating from its powerful body, close enough to offer comfort without demanding anything in return, close enough to suggest that companionship might be possible even between creatures who had learned that trusting others was dangerous. For the first time in 5 years, Elias felt something that might have been peace beginning to unfold in the place where grief had made its home, not the absence of sorrow, but the possibility that sorrow might not have to be the only resident in the house that loss had built around. His heart, the creek was running high and fast, swollen by snowmelt from the warm afternoons that had followed their time in the hidden valley. What should have been a simple crossing had become a test of nerve and judgment, the kind of challenge that separated those who understood mountain water from those who underestimated its power to kill. Elias stood on the bank, studying the current, with the careful attention he'd learned to bring to decisions that could mean the difference between making it home and becoming another cautionary tale about old men who thought they knew better than nature. "Used to be, you could hop across this creek on stepping stones," he told Ghost, who was studying the rushing water with its own brand of feline calculation. "But that was before the late spring we had 3 years back, before the floods rearranged. Off the stream beds, in this part of the mountains, the water was coffee-colored with runoff, moving fast enough to knock a man off his feet if he chose his route poorly. Logs and debris swept past like messages from upstream, telling anyone with sense to wait for calmer conditions. But waiting wasn't an option. The weather forecast called for more snow, and being caught on the wrong side of this creek during a storm would mean spending days in inadequate shelter while supplies ran low and conditions deteriorated. In his jacket pocket, Elias carried the hand-drawn map that he and Tommy had made during one of their early camping trips, when the boy was 12 and fascinated by the idea of documenting their discoveries for future reference. The map showed this creek crossing, marked with Tommy's careful handwriting. "Ford here during low water, rock stable, current not too strong." Below that, in Elias's own hand, a note added years later: "Dangerous during spring runoff. Find alternate route or wait." But there was no alternate route that wouldn't add 2 days to their journey, and Ghost's injured paw, while much improved, wasn't ready for the kind of extended travel that a detour would require. "What do you think, partner?" Elias asked, though he knew the decision would ultimately be his alone. "Think we can make it across if we're smart about it?" Ghost approached the water's edge with the fluid caution that wild things brought to unfamiliar challenges. The great cat's amber eyes tracked the movement of debris in the current, calculating angles and distances with the kind of precision that had kept its ancestors alive for millions of years. After a long moment, it looked back at Elias with what might have been confidence or might have been the kind of fatalistic acceptance that came from understanding that some risks had to be taken regardless of the odds. Tommy was always braver about water crossings than he should have been, Elias said, beginning to strip off his outer layers and seal his essential gear in waterproof bags. Fearless, really. Sarah used to say he got that from me, but I knew. Better. The boy had a confidence in his own abilities that I never possessed, even when I was young and foolish enough to think I was immortal. The memory came sharp and clear. Tommy at 13, insisting he could cross a similar creek during their last camping trip together, the trip that had ended with tragedy, but had begun with the kind of father-son bonding that Elias had treasured. Above all other experiences, the boy standing hip-deep in rushing water, arms spread for balance, grinning with the pure joy of meeting a challenge and finding himself equal to it. I should have made him rope up, Elias said, securing his pack, straps and checking the rifle sling one final time. Should have insisted on safety measures instead of trusting that his natural ability would be enough to keep him safe. But I was proud of his confidence, proud that he wasn't the kind of boy who backed down from reasonable risks. The water was shockingly cold, even through the wool pants and long underwear that provided minimal insulation against mountain runoff that had been snow just hours earlier. Elias stepped carefully from rock to rock, testing each foothold before committing his full weight, using his walking stick as a third point of contact with the stream bed. Ghost entered the water without hesitation, powerful muscles propelling it forward with a grace that made the crossing look effortless despite the current's strength. The great cat moved diagonally downstream, using the water's force to assist rather than fighting it directly, demonstrating the kind of natural wisdom that came from generations of ancestors who'd survived by reading the landscape correctly. Halfway across, Elias felt his foot slip on a moss-covered stone, and for a heart-stopping moment he was off balance, arms windmilling as he fought to regain his footing against a current that suddenly seemed eager to sweep him downstream toward the rapids that waited below the crossing. His walking stick caught between two rocks, providing just enough leverage to let him recover his balance and continue toward the far shore. "Close one," he muttered, though his voice was lost in the sound of rushing water and his own thundering heartbeat. Getting too old for this kind of adventure. But as he said it, he realized it wasn't true. The near fall had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for 20 years. The sharp awareness that came from physical challenge, the heightened perception that accompanied real risk, the sense of being fully alive that only seemed to come when death was present as a possibility rather than an abstraction. Ghost reached the far shore first and turned to watch Elias complete the crossing. Amber eyes alert and ready to react if help became necessary. The great cat's presence was reassuring in a way that surprised him, offering the kind of backup that he'd forgotten existed outside of human relationships. When was the last time anyone had watched out for his safety, had cared whether he made it across a dangerous creek or disappeared beneath water that would carry his body downstream to be found weeks later by strangers who would wonder what an old man had been doing so far from civilization? The last few steps brought him to solid ground, and he stood dripping in the afternoon sun, grateful for the warmth on his face and the steady earth beneath his feet. Ghost approached and brushed against his leg, a gesture that felt like congratulations, or comfort, or simply acknowledgement that they'd faced something difficult together, and both come through it intact. Tommy would have loved that, Elias said, wringing water from his jacket and checking his gear for damage. Would have wanted to do it again, just for the thrill of it. That boy never met a challenge he didn't want to tackle head-on. But even as he spoke, Elias realized the memory carried less pain than it had just days earlier. The sharp edges of grief had been worn smooth by something. Maybe time, maybe the presence of another creature who seemed to understand loss without needing explanation. Maybe simply the accumulated effect of speaking Tommy's name aloud to someone who listened without judgment or advice. They climbed away from the creek through forest that smelled of pine sap and rich earth and the green promise of spring that was still weeks away, but already stirring in the roots and branches that had survived another winter. Ghost moved with increasing confidence, its injured paw obviously much improved, and Elias found himself matching the great cat's rhythm, falling into a companionable pace that spoke of partnership rather than mere proximity. Behind them, the creek continued its urgent journey toward the valley, carrying snowmelt and debris and the memory of two unlikely companions who'd trusted each other enough to face the crossing together, who'd found in that shared risk a deepening of whatever it was that had brought them together in the wilderness, where loneliness was supposed to be the natural state of things. Elias discovered the collar by accident, his fingers finding the unexpected band of weathered leather and metal while grooming the mats from Ghost's thick winter coat. The great cat had been allowing these sessions of careful brushing and detangling, seeming to understand that the attention was meant as care rather than dominance. But when Elias's hand encountered the foreign object hidden beneath the dense fur at the base of Ghost's neck, both man and lion froze. "What's this now?" Elias murmured, working his fingers carefully around the collar's circumference. It was old, the leather cracked and stained by years of weather, but the metal components were still intact. A small plastic box was attached to one side, about the size of a matchbook, with what looked like solar panels on its surface and a tiny antenna that had been bent but not broken. Ghost tolerated the examination with patient dignity, though Elias could feel the tension in the great cat's muscles, the readiness to flee or fight if this unexpected development proved threatening. But after a few moments, when it became clear that the human's intentions remained benevolent, Ghost relaxed and allowed Elias to work the collar free from where it had been partially grown over by fur and scar tissue. "GPS tracking collar," Elias said, turning the device over in his hands. "University research project, from the look of it. But this thing's been on you for a long time, hasn't it? Long enough that you nearly grew around it." The collar bore a small metal plate with engraved text that was still legible despite years of wear. "Montana State University Wildlife Research. Project Cougar 2018. If found, contact Dr. Sarah Martinez, Dept of Ecology." Below that, a phone number that Elias knew he would never call, and a serial number that meant nothing to him but probably represented years of data about Ghost's movements and behavior. 2018, Elias said, doing the math in his head. "That's 7 years ago. You've been carrying this thing around for 7 years, haven't you? 7 years of being tracked and monitored and treated like a research subject instead of a living creature, with your own desires and instincts." The implications hit him like a physical blow. Ghost wasn't just any mountain lion. He was an escaped research animal, a creature who'd been captured as a young cat, fitted with tracking equipment and studied by scientists who saw him as data rather than as an individual with his own history and motivations. The unusual size, the lack of normal predator wariness around humans, the intelligence that seemed almost human, all of it made sense now. Elias set the collar aside and looked into Ghost's amber eyes, seeing the great cat with new understanding. "They took you from your territory, didn't they? Captured you when you were young, probably told themselves they were doing important research that would help your species. But what they really did was turn you into a laboratory subject who happened to live in the wild." Memory flooded back. News reports from years ago about a university research project studying mountain lion behavior in the northern Rockies. Controversy about the ethics of capturing and collaring wild animals. Protests from environmental groups who argued that the research was more intrusive than informative. He'd paid little attention at the time, wrapped up as he was in his own grief and the daily challenge of surviving his isolation. But now the details came back with uncomfortable clarity. The research had involved capturing young mountain lions, fitting them with sophisticated tracking collars and monitoring their movements for years to understand territory patterns, hunting behavior, and social interactions. Several animals had been involved, including one exceptionally large male that had escaped from the research facility before the tracking phase could begin. That was you, wasn't it? Elias said, running his hand along Ghost's powerful flank. You broke free before they could complete their study, disappeared into the wilderness where they couldn't follow. But you were still carrying their equipment, still being monitored even though you thought you were free. The tracking device was more sophisticated than anything he'd seen before, clearly designed to collect and transmit detailed information about the animal's location, activity levels, and probably biometric data like heart rate and body temperature. The solar panels meant it could operate indefinitely, recharging itself from ambient light while sending regular data transmissions to researchers who saw Ghost not as an individual, but as a valuable source of scientific information. No wonder you're different from other mountain lions, Elias said, his voice heavy with a new understanding of the parallels between them. You're not truly wild, and you're not truly domesticated. You're something in between. Something that was shaped by human intervention, but never fully controlled by it. He thought about the gentle way Ghost had taken food from his fingers, the lack of fear or aggression that had characterized their first encounter, the almost human intelligence in those amber eyes. These weren't natural behaviors for a wild mountain lion. They were the behaviors of a creature who'd been handled by humans during its formative months, who'd learned that human contact didn't necessarily mean danger. But there was more to the story, Elias realized. The collar showed signs of having been damaged and repaired multiple times, suggesting that Ghost had tried repeatedly to remove it, had fought against the constraint without success. There were old scars around the collar line where the leather had chafed, evidence of years spent carrying equipment that served human purposes while providing no benefit to the animal who bore it. They stole your freedom, Elias said, turning the collar over in his weathered hands. Maybe not intentionally, maybe they told themselves they were helping your species survive. But what they really did was take a wild creature and turn him into a research subject, a walking data collection device, who couldn't consent to the experiment being performed on his life. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine boughs above them, casting shadows that danced with the wind. Ghost had settled beside him, with the relaxed posture that suggested complete trust. Amber eyes half closed, in the kind of contentment that came from being in the presence of someone who meant no harm. But now Elias understood the deeper significance of that trust. It represented Ghost's choice to form a connection, despite having been betrayed by humans before. You know what the saddest part is? Elias continued, his voice barely audible above the wind in the trees. I bet they lost track of you years ago. Bet this collar stopped transmitting data when you disappeared into the deep wilderness where cell towers can't reach, and satellite coverage is spotty. They probably wrote you off as a loss, moved on to other research subjects, forgot all about the individual animal they tagged and numbered and reduced to data points. He thought about his own experience with being reduced to categories and statistics, the widower, the man who'd lost a child, the hermit who'd chosen isolation over integration. How many forms had he filled out over the years that required him to check boxes, that described his loss in terms that bureaucrats could understand and process? How many times had he been treated as a case study rather than as a person whose grief was unique and personal and not subject to generalization? We're both escapees, aren't we? He said, scratching behind Ghost's ears with the kind of gentle attention that the great cat had come to accept and even seek out. Both of us ran away from situations where other people thought they knew what was best for us, where our individual needs mattered less than some larger purpose we hadn't chosen. The collar felt heavier than its actual weight, burdened with implications about freedom and captivity, about the difference between studying something and understanding it, about the ways that well-intentioned people could inflict harm by treating living creatures as objects of research rather than as individuals with their own inherent worth. I'm going to take this off you, Elias said, reaching for the multi-tool he always carried. Should have been removed years ago, should never have been put on you in the first place without your consent. But I can fix that much, at least. The Leather had been softened by years of weather and wear, and the buckle mechanism, while corroded, still functioned. Elias worked carefully, talking in soothing tones, while Ghost remained still and patient, perhaps understanding that something significant was happening, even if the full meaning remained beyond feline comprehension. When the collar finally came, "Free!" Ghost shook his massive head and rolled in the pine needles, rubbing the spot where the leather had rested for 7 long years. The action seemed celebratory, a physical expression of relief that transcended species boundaries and spoke to the universal desire to be free of constraints imposed by others. "There," Elias said, tossing the collar aside, where it landed with a small thud that seemed to echo with finality. "Now you're really free. Free to choose where you go and who you trust, and whether you want company or solitude. Free to be exactly what you are, instead of what someone else thinks you should be." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow with shades of gold and pink that would fade with darkness, Elias realized that removing the collar had been as much about his own freedom as Ghost's. For 7 years, the great cat had carried the burden of unwanted monitoring, unwanted control, unwanted definition by others. For 20 years, Elias had carried the burden of unwanted guilt, unwanted isolation, unwanted definition as a man, who'd failed in the most important responsibility he'd ever been given. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for both of them to stop carrying burdens that had never been theirs to bear in the first place. The compass had stopped working 20 years ago on the day Tommy died, its needle frozen at northeast, no matter which direction Elias pointed it. He'd kept it anyway, carrying it in his jacket pocket like a talisman that had lost its magic but retained its meaning. Now, as he led Ghost through the increasingly familiar terrain toward a place he'd sworn never to visit again, the broken compass seemed to grow heavier with each step. "We're getting close now," he said, his voice tight with an emotion that felt too large for his chest to contain. "Another mile, maybe less. 20 years I've avoided this place, taken every possible detour to keep from having to see it again, but I think it's time." Ghost padded beside him with the silent grace that had earned the great cat his name, amber eyes alert to the tension that radiated from his human companion like heat from a forge. The animal seemed to sense they were approaching something significant, some destination that carried weight beyond simple geography. The terrain was achingly familiar, despite the passage of 2 decades. The same granite outcropping where they'd stopped to rest during that last hunting trip. The same stand of lodgepole pine where Tommy had found a shed elk antler and carried it proudly for half a mile before realizing it was too heavy to pack out. The same game trail that wound upward through forest that grew thinner as elevation increased, opening onto the series of ledges and meadows where elk liked to graze in the early morning hours. Tommy was so excited about this hunt, Elias said, his breath coming harder as they climbed toward the place where his world had broken apart. Talked about it for weeks beforehand, planned what we'd do with the meat, how he'd help me process it and package it for the freezer. He was 15 and ready to take on more responsibility, ready to be treated like the young man he was becoming, instead of the boy he'd been. In his jacket pocket beside the broken compass, Elias carried a small leather pouch that contained items he'd buried at the accident site 20 years ago, but had never been able to leave there permanently. Tommy's jackknife, the one with the bone handle that the boy had been so proud to receive for his 14th birthday. A photograph of the 3 of them, Elias, Sarah, Tommy, taken the previous Christmas when they were still a complete family and the future stretched ahead like an unmarked map full of possibilities, and a letter written in Tommy's careful handwriting that had been meant as a surprise for Father's Day but had been found in the boy's room after the funeral. "Dear Dad," it began, "I wanted to tell you how much I've learned from all our hunting trips together. You've taught me about more than just tracking and shooting. You've taught me about respect for nature and taking only what we need and being grateful for everything the wilderness gives us. I hope when I'm older I can be the kind of father to my kids that you've been to me." The letter was folded and refolded, soft as cloth from being handled by fingers that shook every time they touched it. Elias had read it so many times he could recite it from memory, but he still carried the physical pages because they bore his son's handwriting, loops and angles that had been shaped by a living hand that would never write another word. "I brought some of his things back here after the funeral," Elias told Ghost, who was listening with the focused attention that suggested he understood these words carried more weight than simple conversation. "Couldn't bear to keep them in the house where Sarah had to see them every day, couldn't bear to throw them away or give them to someone else. So I buried them here, thinking that would bring some kind of closure. But the burial had brought no peace, only a different kind of torment. The knowledge that pieces of Tommy's life were scattered in a place where his body wasn't, where the items that had mattered to him were slowly returning to earth while the questions that had killed him remained unanswered. Why hadn't Elias been paying closer attention? Why hadn't he anticipated the danger of the cliff edge that wasn't marked on any map? Why had he allowed his excitement over the elk to override his responsibility to keep his son safe? The final approach took them through a boulder field where the stones had been scattered by some ancient geological event, creating a maze of passages and dead ends that required careful navigation. Ghost moved through the rocks with feline grace, but Elias found himself struggling more than he should have, his boots slipping on surfaces made treacherous by patches of ice that had formed in the shadows where sunlight never reached. "This is where it gets dangerous," he said, pausing to catch his breath and check his footing before proceeding. "The rocks are unstable here, shifted by freeze-thaw cycles and the occasional earthquake. Tommy knew to be careful. I'd taught him about reading terrain, about testing each step before committing to it, but he was excited, distracted by the prospect of finally getting his first elk." The memory came back with painful clarity. Tommy's face that morning, bright with anticipation, and the kind of confidence that came from spending years learning woodcraft from a father who'd made the wilderness his life study. The boy had been ready for this level of responsibility, ready to handle a rifle in hunting conditions, ready to field dress an elk and pack out the meat and tell the story around campfires for years to come. But readiness didn't account for momentary lapses in judgment, for the way excitement could override caution, for the simple human tendency to focus so intently on one thing that other things became invisible. Tommy had been watching the elk, following its movement with the intensity that good hunters brought to their quarry, when he stepped backward to get a clearer shot and found nothing but air beneath his boot. 43 feet, Elias said. The number burned into his memory with the precision that trauma brought to certain details. The search and rescue team measured it afterward, said he probably died on impact, said it would have been quick, that he wouldn't have suffered. They meant it as comfort, but somehow that made it worse, knowing that all those years of teaching him to survive in the wilderness hadn't mattered, because 43 feet was too far to survive, no matter how prepared you were. The ledge where it had happened came into view as they crested a ridge that had been carved by wind and weather into something resembling a natural amphitheater. The granite shelf jutted out over a drop that looked even more precipitous than Elias remembered, falling away to a pile of broken stone that had been accumulating at the bottom for centuries. Above the ledge, a lightning-struck pine tree stood like a monument to the violence that nature could inflict without warning or malice, its trunk split and scarred, but still alive, still growing, despite the damage it had sustained. "That's the tree," Elias said, pointing to the lightning-scarred pine. "It was struck the same day Tommy died, during the storm that came through while I was waiting for the rescue team. Sarah said later it was a sign that the lightning marked the spot. So we'd never forget, but forgetting was never the problem. Remembering was what nearly killed me." Ghost approached the edge of the ledge with careful curiosity, amber eyes studying the drop that had claimed a young life 20 years earlier. The great cat seemed to understand they were in a place where tragedy lived, where the normal rules of safety and survival had failed someone who'd trusted those rules to keep him protected. Weather was building again over the western peaks, dark clouds that promised snow and wind, and the kind of conditions that could trap travelers in exposed places where exposure became a lethal adversary. The temperature was dropping as afternoon faded toward evening, and the smart thing would be to retreat to lower elevations where shelter was available and the margin for error was greater. But Elias had carried his burden to this place for a reason that went deeper than smart decisions. For 20 years, he'd avoided the spot where his son had died, telling himself he was protecting his own sanity by staying away from the geography of loss. But avoidance had become its own kind of prison, a cell built from unspoken words and unfinished business, and the terrible weight of guilt that grew heavier instead of lighter with the passage of time. "I need to tell him I'm sorry," Elias said, settling himself on a granite boulder that offered a view of the lightning-struck tree and the ledge beyond. "Need to say the words I should have said 20 years ago, before the guilt got so big it crowded out everything else. Maybe that sounds foolish to you, talking to someone who can't hear anymore, but I think maybe the hearing isn't the point." Ghost settled beside him with the patient dignity that had characterized their entire relationship, a wild creature choosing to offer comfort to a damaged human who'd never asked for comfort but desperately needed it. The great cat's presence was steadying, a reminder that healing could happen between creatures who understood loss without needing explanations or apologies or promises that the future would be different from the past. Above them, the storm clouds continued their inexorable approach, bringing with them the kind of weather that had turned this place into a killing ground 20 years ago. But this time, Elias wasn't running from the storm. This time he was prepared to face whatever the wilderness chose to throw at him, confident that he had a partner who understood the difference between surviving and living, between carrying guilt and carrying forward the memory of love that had been interrupted but not destroyed by tragedy. The storm struck with the sudden fury that only mountain weather could unleash, transforming the landscape from merely dangerous to actively lethal in the space of minutes. One moment Elias was sitting beside the lightning-struck pine, gathering courage to speak words that had been 20 years in the making, and the next he was fighting for survival against wind that howled like a living thing and snow that fell sideways in sheets thick enough to erase the world beyond arm's length. "Ghost!" he called, though his voice was instantly swallowed by the storm's roar. The great cat had been beside him moments earlier, but now Elias could see nothing but white chaos, hear nothing but the wind's relentless assault on the granite, ledges that had become a trap instead of a destination. Lightning split the sky with violence that made the air taste of metal and ozone, followed by thunder so close it seemed to originate inside his chest. The same lightning-struck pine that had marked Tommy's death 20 years ago groaned and swayed in the wind, its damaged trunk flexing dangerously as gusts tried to finish what electricity had started decades earlier. This was the same kind of storm, Elias realized with crystalline clarity, that came from facing mortal danger. The same sudden weather that had moved through on the day Tommy died, turning what should have been a celebration of successful hunting into a nightmare of rescue. Attempts and ultimately futile helicopter flights to trauma centers that couldn't repair what 43 feet of granite had broken. "He should have seen it coming," he said to the wind, words that applied both to the current storm and to the tragedy that had shaped the last 20 years of his life. "Should have read the signs, should have gotten us both to safety before the weather turned." But shouldering responsibility for things beyond human control had been his pattern for 2 decades, and the storm didn't care about his self-recrimination. The wind cared only about testing his ability to survive in conditions that could kill exposed humans in minutes, and the snow cared only about obscuring landmarks until even familiar terrain became a maze with no exit. Ghost materialized from the white chaos. Like an answer to prayers Elias hadn't known he was praying. The great cat's golden form, barely visible but unmistakably present as he pressed close against Elias's side. The animal's fur was already thick with snow, but his amber eyes held the kind of calm determination that suggested panic was a luxury wild things couldn't afford when survival was at stake. "Good boy," Elias said, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Stay close. We're going to get through this together, just like Tommy and I should have gotten through that day if I'd been paying better attention." The cliff edge that had claimed his son was somewhere nearby, but in the whiteout conditions it had become invisible, unmarked, as dangerous as it had been 20 years ago when excitement over elk hunting had made a careful boy careless for one fatal moment. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. He'd finally returned to face his demons, only to find himself trapped in the same conditions that had created those demons in the first place. Lightning struck again, close enough that the thunder was instantaneous, and the flash revealed the landscape in stark black and white detail for a fraction of a second. In that brief illumination, Elias saw the ledge where Tommy had fallen, saw the pine tree that had been split by electricity on the day rescue became recovery, saw the rocky ground that offered no shelter and precious few handholds for a man, trying not to repeat his son's mistake. 20 years I've been afraid of this place," he told Ghost, who was pressed against his leg like a warm anchor in the chaos of wind and snow. 20 years of avoiding it because I thought facing it would break something inside me that was already cracked beyond repair. But maybe breaking is what needs to happen before healing can start." The wind was trying to push them toward the cliff edge, and Elias found himself fighting against gusts that felt strong enough to lift a man off his feet and hurl him into the same abyss that had swallowed his son. But this time he wasn't alone, wasn't carrying the double burden of his own survival and responsibility for someone else's safety. This time he had Ghost beside him, a creature who understood survival in ways that transcended human anxiety about mortality. Another lightning strike illuminated the pine tree, and in its harsh light Elias could see something carved into the bark that he'd forgotten was there. A heart shape with initials inside, carved during a family camping trip when Tommy was 10, and the future stretched ahead like an unmarked trail full of possibilities. E+T. The carving read in letters that had grown wider as the tree expanded over the years, but remained readable despite the damage lightning had inflicted on the surrounding bark. Elias plus Sarah plus Tommy. The mathematical expression of a family that had existed completely for such a brief time, reduced now to scar tissue on a tree that refused to die despite being struck by forces beyond its control. The carved heart in the lightning-struck pine seemed to pulse with each flash of electricity, the letters E+S+T growing more visible as the storm intensified rather than less. Elias stared at the carving, through wind-driven snow that should have obscured it, remembering the day Tommy had insisted on adding their family's mark to the tree that already bore dozens of initials from other visitors who'd wanted to claim some small piece of permanence in the wilderness. "Dad, look," Tommy had said, his 10-year-old voice bright with discovery. "This tree has been collecting families for years. Can we add ours too? Can we show that we were here together?" And Elias had lifted the boy on his shoulders so Tommy could reach high enough to carve their initials with the jackknife that Sarah had given him for his birthday. The same knife that now rested in Elias's pocket, carried for 20 years like a talisman that had lost its power to protect but retained its power to remember. Ghost pressed closer as another gust tried to drive them toward the cliff edge, and suddenly Elias understood that survival wasn't about avoiding the place where Tommy had died. It was about choosing to live despite having been broken by loss that felt too large to carry. The storm wasn't trying to kill him. It was testing whether he still had reasons to keep fighting when fighting became difficult. "I failed you, son," Elias said, his words carried away by wind, but spoken with the clarity that came from finally admitting what he'd known for 20 years. Failed. To keep you safe, when keeping you safe was the most important job I'd ever been given. But I think maybe I failed you in other ways too. Failed to live the kind of life you would have wanted me to live. Failed to honor your memory with something better than guilt and isolation. Lightning illuminated the carved tree again, and this time Elias saw it not as a monument to loss, but as evidence of love that had existed completely, if briefly. Tommy had wanted their family's mark on that tree because he'd understood something at 10 that his father was only learning at 72, that love was worth commemorating even when you couldn't guarantee its permanence. Ghost moved with sudden purpose, circling around Elias and positioning himself as a windbreak between the man and the cliff edge that had become invisible in the storm, but remained deadly nonetheless. The great cat's body provided shelter and warmth, and the kind of steadying presence that allowed clear thinking even in chaos. "You know what, Ghost?" Elias said, reaching into his jacket to pull out Tommy's jackknife, the bone handle worn smooth by eager young fingers that would never grow old. "I think my boy would have liked you, would have been fascinated by everything about you. Your size, your intelligence. The way you move like liquid courage through country that scares most people senseless." The knife blade caught lightning flashes as Elias opened it, revealing steel that Tommy had kept sharp enough to shave with because the boy had taken pride in maintaining his tools properly. For 20 years, Elias had carried this knife without using it, treating it like a museum piece too precious to risk damaging with actual work. But tools were meant to be used, not preserved. And Tommy's knife had work left to do. Elias approached the lightning-struck pine with Ghost beside him, wind whipping snow around them in spirals that would have been beautiful if they hadn't been deadly. The tree's damaged bark was rough beneath his fingers as he found space near the old family carving, and the knife bit into wood that had survived lightning strikes and decades of mountain weather without giving up the fight to keep growing. E+S T+G, he carved, adding Ghost's initial to the family group that had been incomplete for 20 years. The letters took shape slowly in the storm's harsh light, each cut deliberate and deep enough to last through whatever weather the future might bring. "There," he said, closing the knife and returning it to his pocket where it belonged. "Now you're part of it too, part of what's left of us, part of what continues even when individual pieces get lost along the way." Ghost nuzzled against his hand with surprising gentleness, and Elias realized that the storm was beginning to weaken, that the wind's howling was becoming less frantic, and the snow was falling more vertically than horizontally. The worst of it was passing, moving on to test other travelers in other places, leaving behind air that tasted of ozone and possibility. "Tommy wouldn't want me to keep carrying guilt like it was my most precious possession," Elias said, speaking to the carved tree and the storm and the ghost of a boy who died too young, but had lived completely while he'd had the chance. "He'd want me to take care of the living, including myself, including you, including whatever comes next that needs taking care of." For the first time in 20 years, Elias felt something that might have been forgiveness beginning to unfold in the place where guilt had made its home. Not the absence of sorrow that would always be there, but the possibility that sorrow could coexist with other things, better things, things that honored memory by embracing life instead of rejecting it. 6 months later, the wooden sign stood at the entrance to what had once been simply Elias Cade's property and was now something larger, something that served purposes beyond one man's need for solitude. "Ghost Mountain Ranch, Wildlife Sanctuary," the carved letters read, painted in forest green against weathered pine that had been cut from trees on the property itself. Below the main text, smaller words, "In memory of Thomas Cade, who believed every creature deserves respect and protection, Elias stepped back to admire his handiwork, the sign representing months of planning and preparation that had transformed his isolated cabin into a place where families could come to learn about the wilderness without having to conquer it. The changes had been gradual but profound. A visitor center built from logs he'd milled himself, trails marked for different skill levels, educational materials about mountain wildlife that he'd researched with the thoroughness of a man who'd discovered he still had things to learn about the country he'd called home for decades. Ghost appeared at the edge of the clearing, as if summoned by thoughts of him, moving with the silent grace that had earned his name, but now carrying himself with a confidence that spoke of healing completed rather than healing attempted. The great cat's injured paw had healed completely, leaving only the faintest of scars to mark where steel trap teeth had once threatened to cripple him permanently. "There you are, partner," Elias said, though he wasn't surprised by Ghost's appearance. The mountain lion had developed a habit of showing up whenever visitors were expected, as if he understood that his presence was part of what made the sanctuary special. "Got a family coming this afternoon, parents and 2 kids who want to learn about tracking. Thought you might want to make one of your famous appearances." The relationship between man and lion had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Ghost remained fundamentally wild, coming and going as his instincts dictated, disappearing for days at a time to hunt and patrol territory that extended far beyond the sanctuary's boundaries. But he always returned, drawn by bonds that transcended the simple exchange of food and shelter that characterized most human-animal relationships. More remarkable still was what had happened 3 months ago, when Ghost had appeared at the edge of the meadow, accompanied by a female mountain lion, whose coat was lighter than his, but whose amber eyes held the same intelligence. She'd maintained her distance, watching the sanctuary's activities with the wariness that truly wild animals brought to human presence. But her acceptance of Ghost's unusual lifestyle had been evident in the way she'd settled beside him during their visits, content to observe this strange partnership without feeling threatened by it. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Elias had told Ghost during one of those early visits. "Looks like you've found yourself a companion who understands that some things can't be explained, only accepted." The female had since denned somewhere in the high country, and Ghost's occasional absences now carried the urgency of a mate, tending to responsibilities that Elias could only guess at. But each time the great cat returned, he seemed more complete, more settled into a life that balanced wild independence with chosen companionship. The afternoon's visitors arrived precisely on time, a family from Missoula whose children had been studying Montana wildlife in school and had convinced their parents that a trip to the sanctuary would be educational as well as adventurous. Elias met them at the trailhead, noting with approval that they'd dressed appropriately for mountain weather and carried the kind of respectful curiosity that made teaching a pleasure rather than a chore. "Mr. Cade?" The father extended his hand, with the firm grip of a man who worked with his hands for a living. "I'm Dave Peterson. This is my wife Linda and our kids Jake and Emma. We can't tell you how excited we are to be here." The children were perhaps 8 and 10, old enough to understand that they were in the presence of something special, but young enough to approach the experience with the kind of open wonder that adults had to work to recapture. Emma, the younger of the 2, carried a notebook with a pen attached by string, clearly planning to document everything she saw for future reference. "Well, welcome to Ghost Mountain," Elias said, falling naturally into the role of educator that had surprised him with how well it fit. "The first thing you need to know about tracking is that it's not just about following footprints. It's about learning to read the stories that animals write in the landscape as they go about their daily business." He led them along the trail that he'd developed specifically for families, pointing out signs that ranged from the obvious to the subtle. Deer tracks in mud beside the creek, bear claw marks on aspen bark, the gnawed stumps that marked beaver territory, the oval depressions in snow where elk had bedded down during the previous night's storm. Every track tells a story, he explained, watching Jake crouch down to examine a particularly clear set of coyote prints. This one tells us that a coyote passed through here this morning, probably on his way to check the creek for unwary rodents. See how the prints are evenly spaced? That means he was trotting, not running, which suggests he wasn't being chased or chasing anything himself. Emma was scribbling furiously in her notebook, trying to capture not just the information, but the excitement of learning to see the wilderness as something more than empty space between towns. Her enthusiasm reminded Elias painfully of Tommy at that age, hungry for knowledge about the natural world and eager to prove he could handle the responsibilities that came with wilderness education. As they rounded a bend in the trail that opened onto the meadow where Elias had built his visitor center, Ghost materialized from the timber with the perfect timing that had made him the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador. The family froze, children pressing closer to their parents, while all four humans stared at the magnificent predator who regarded them with calm, amber eyes. "That's Ghost," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of reverence that the great cat's presence always inspired. "He's the reason this place exists, the reason I learned that some friendships can heal wounds you thought would never stop bleeding." The mountain lion settled himself in the meadow grass about 50 yards away, close enough for the family to observe his size and grace, but far enough to avoid triggering flight responses in visitors who might not understand that aggression wasn't in part of his vocabulary when it came to humans under Elias's protection. "He's enormous," Linda whispered, her voice carrying more awe than fear. "I had no idea mountain lions could grow so large." "Ghost's special in a lot of ways," Elias replied, watching the great cat with the kind of affection that had grown from shared experiences and mutual respect. "But the most important thing about him isn't his size, it's his willingness to trust, even after humans gave him reasons not to." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the meadow with the golden light that made everything look touched by magic, Elias found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 20 years of guilt and isolation had been necessary, he realized now. Not because punishment was required, but because some kinds of healing couldn't be rushed, some kinds of forgiveness couldn't be forced. Tommy would have loved this place, would have been fascinated by every aspect of the sanctuary's mission, and delighted by Ghost's presence in ways that transcended simple appreciation for wildlife. The boy would have understood intuitively what had taken his father decades to learn, that respect for living things was the foundation of all meaningful relationships, whether between humans or between species that seemed to have nothing in common except the desire to survive and occasionally thrive. As the Peterson family prepared to leave, promising to return and to tell their friends about the sanctuary, Ghost rose from his resting place and padded over to where Elias stood. The great cat's presence was a reminder that some partnerships transcended explanation. Some friendships developed their own logic that had nothing to do with species or circumstances, and everything to do with the recognition of kinship between creatures who'd learned to carry loss without being destroyed by it. The mountains held their secrets close as another day faded into memory. But some secrets were worth keeping, and some mysteries were more valuable than their solutions. In the growing twilight, man and lion sat together in comfortable silence, two unlikely partners who'd found in each other exactly what they'd needed to heal. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of understanding. Not the erasure of the past, but the possibility of a future built on foundations stronger than grief.